Good evening, everybody. We're just waiting for people to take their seats on the Zoom side of tonight's webinar. So I'll just let that fill up a little before I formally welcome you and introduce our guests for this evening's event. So welcome everybody. Good evening. My name's Mark Littlewood. I'm the Director General here at the Institute of Economic Affairs. A very, very warm welcome to the first in a new series of In Conversation events where I sit down with a politician, thought leader or newsmaker, or in the case of today's guests, all three combined into one human being, to discuss their philosophy, their views, what they think of the world today. Before I introduced this evening's guest, let me just run through a quick number of housekeeping points. We're broadcasting this both on YouTube and on Zoom. I've only got a sight of the Zoom side of the conversation. So if you're on the Zoom side and want to put a question to our guest this evening, please put that in the Q&A section, not in the chat, in the Q&A section on Zoom. You can be anonymous if you wish to. If you're far too shy to ask a question yourself, even anonymously, you can actually vote on the other questions. And being a democratic kind of guy, I'm more likely to take the questions that have been upvoted towards the top of the list. So if you have a view on which questions I should be putting to our speaker, please put those questions in the Q&A and vote on them in the Q&A. Anyway, for our first In Conversation, I'm absolutely delighted, as I say, to welcome somebody who embodies not just being a politician, a thought leader and a newsmaker, but all three. Sir Graham Brady, the Member of Parliament for Altrincham and Sale West, a seat he has represented since 1997, when I think the Conservative Parliamentary Party was less than half its present size when Graham was first elected. He is, of course, famously the current chair of the 1922 committee, the backbench committee of Conservative MPs, and has played integral roles in some of the great pieces of political theatre in recent years. He has served across a wide range of select committees, most recently the Treasury Select Committee, and has been a staunch defender both of personal liberty and fiscal conservatism within the Conservative Party. So Graham, it's an absolute pleasure to have you with us. Very, very good evening to you.
Good evening.
So I'm going to kick off by asking you a wide range of very eclectic and searching questions before we come to our audience. And inevitably, I'm going to start with the lockdown, the tier system. You were against the imposition of the second lockdown. I've become more and more sceptical about these lockdowns the longer it's gone on. I think I was quite sympathetic to the government back in March, but it seems to me now that the cure is worse than the disease. Can you tell me, Sir Graham, what you think's wrong with the government strategy? And if you were the Prime Minister, rather than the most influential senior backbencher, what you would be doing differently?
Well, thanks for the question, Mark. And I think that is such a good way of putting it, because we should all start from the recognition that this really is a difficult set of choices. And I don't think any of us envies the people who do have to make those decisions. My view back in March was probably a little bit like yours, when the government was asking for a 3-week lockdown in order to make sure that NHS critical care capacity wasn't overwhelmed. And we knew very little about the virus and how quickly it might spread and how virulent it was and how what the fatality rate of it was and so on. It seemed sensible to give the government that sweeping power that we gave them at that point. But what really started to concern me was that, first of all, every time the 3-weekly reviews happened, it just carried on, nothing changed. And then increasingly became frustrating that there was really virtually no parliamentary process to supervise and scrutinize that. So I guess my first concern was that it seemed to become a habit to take the most cautious position possible, whereas my view is we should start from the premise that people should be as free as possible to get on with their lives in a safe way. So back in April, I guess I was calling for the reopening of garden centres and outdoor markets to be able to trade, things that we knew were going to be pretty safe. But we could have started that kind of gradual reopening of the economy, but also gradual reopening of normal life much earlier. And then as we moved through into the summer and we were seeing restaurants and pubs and things opening again, they were doing it against a set of very clear criteria for making their premises COVID secure. So we said, please open, but this is how you do it safely. And and then we started to subsidize people to go and eat out in those places. And then these poor people who've done everything and spent money to make their premises safe, we then turn around and say, oh no, nobody can come to your premises at all, even though we told you that this was going to be a safe environment. So I think whilst being sympathetic to the challenge the government faces, what I want is for the government to be looking at it all from the point of view of the people, saying, how can we make sure that people can live as full and fulfilling a life as possible, but do so reasonably safely?
Okay, so I want to pick through some of that before I move on to some other questions. I want to start by saying, do you think the goalposts have changed? I mean, you say, Sir Graham, that caution, the most cautious option on the menu is always the one that they've picked. But back in March, it was all about let's not allow the health service to be overwhelmed. I was told, I had to protect the NHS. I always thought the NHS was there to protect me, but you learn something every day. It's our duty to protect the NHS, apparently not the other way around. But that, if you like, worked. And I got the sense of that we might not be able to stop the spread of the virus, but it will be an absolute nightmare if we all get it next Tuesday. So sort of flatten the curve a bit, because there's only so many hospital beds and only so many ventilators and all of the rest. But it now seems to be, and they haven't articulated this, but the government's policy appears to be lockdown until we've vaccinated everyone. That's a completely different proposition to the one that was explained to us back in the spring, is it not?
Yeah, I think we saw that mission creep happen through April and May as well. But then, oddly, on Saturday, when Michael Gove was writing in the Times, we were back again to the NHS will be overwhelmed. And I have to say that conversations I have with have a lot of doctors who are constituents, but also NHS managers in Greater Manchester. I think the NHS has actually done a pretty good job of using the time available to improve its systems, to make sure they could have COVID hospitals and non-COVID hospitals, to make sure that they have increased capacity in ICU, even before you look at the Nightingale hospitals, which have been only used very little, and in Manchester only being used for general beds to relieve the pressure there. So, I think the NHS has done a good job of that. We've also seen doctors picking up much more effective treatments for COVID-19. And yet we find ourselves back again with this clarion call, we've got to save the NHS. And so, yes, I think we've seen mission creep throughout. And I think there's perhaps some of the confusion arises now because people are looking forward to vaccines which might start to make a difference in the early part of next year. But there's obviously a very big supply and distribution problem, even if those vaccines are as good as we hope they are.
Yeah. So is your view now that we could, I mean, I'm not suggesting there's any sign the government's minded to do this, but if the decision could be yours, that you would move to a position which was almost exclusively guidance? If you're over the age of 75 and diabetic, you'll probably want to stay at home until you're vaccinated. But if you're 23 and a professional football player, you can probably go about your business as normal. Here's the guidance. Here's guidance to business on how to organise social distancing in a restaurant. But there's not going to be a legal obligation. There's just going to be a steer, in the same way that the government, might advise you what to do when flooding happens or there's a particularly bad weather forecast or some such like. Would it be exclusively guidance, or what coercion do you think can still be justified against the population as a whole?
Well, Mark, I don't think that freedom is an absolute, but I do think it should be a presumption. So I just think we should start from the premise that we should always question ourselves before resorting to coercion. There must be a compelling case for something if we're going to use the law, especially when it comes to aspects of people's very personal private lives. I wrote an article a while ago saying we got to a particular low point when Matt Hancock was prescribing who you could sleep with and who you couldn't. So whether it be people's right to form and maintain intimate relationships, whether it be telling people that it's illegal for them to see their children or grandchildren or to visit an elderly relative in a care home. These are things where I think they're very, very personal, private choices. We've all heard from those people, older people who might say, look, I don't think I'm going to be here for very much longer. I might die next year anyway, but I don't want to die miserable having not seen my family or friends for the intervening time. So my instinct is always to say, avoid compulsion and coercion where it is possible and there is a reasonable alternative. And I think, and I was making this point back in May, June in the House of Commons, I think that you can respond in two different ways to evidence that most people were complying with what they were being asked to do remarkably happily. And so you can either say, therefore, you need to clamp down on the buggers and make sure they do as they're told. Or you can say, actually, people have mostly demonstrated a very high degree of responsibility and common sense. Let's work with that. So as you say, we can protect some of the most vulnerable people, not by force, but by good advice. I'm glad to see finally the NHS has now, the Department of Health has agreed to start sending vitamin D supplements to the most vulnerable people. I don't know why that wasn't being done back in June, when we first had a pretty good idea that it might make a difference. So there's quite a lot that could be done to help people to protect themselves, sending them hand sanitizer, sending them vitamin D supplements, making sure there are safe hours of the day when they can go shopping, or 8 days of the week when they can go shopping. Let's do more of that and less of the blanket arbitrary rules.
Let's come on a bit to the economics of lockdown. It seems to me that you and I are of a similar opinion here, but if you take the premise of a lockdown as strict as the government is enforcing, there are obviously pretty severe economic and fiscal consequences that derive directly from that. We're going to have an eye-watering budget deficit this year. In the spending review, the Chancellor suggested touching 400 billion. Probably, this is my guesstimate, it's not an official figure, the tax take as a proportion of GDP, not in sterling terms, but as a proportion of GDP, will be the highest for half a century this year. There's going, the furlough scheme, which was, intended to wind down by October, has been extended and extended and extended. Meanwhile, really, the eye of the economic storm, which the Chancellor concedes has not yet hit, because these are artificial ways, really, of having a sombrero recession rather than just a health pandemic. But what's your take on the scale of economic damage that this is bringing about in the economy, and the government's likely road to repair there? I mean, should we all brace ourselves, those of us who are lucky enough to keep our jobs in 6 months or 12 months' time, to having to pay an awful lot more tax to pay back the absolutely eye-watering hole in the public finances?
Well, I think we should brace ourselves for it. I hope we can avoid some of the worst elements of that. Certainly early on, I think it would be a serious mistake to ramp up taxes, and that might actually impede the recovery that we hope we'll start to see after the first quarter next year. But it's pretty clear there already has been very serious economic damage. There's going to be further serious economic damage done by this lockdown. And if we have these very severe tier restrictions introduced from the 2nd of December, that will have a further negative economic effect. And it's tempting for some people to say, oh, they're just bothered about the economy and people making money. We've already seen that these things have very real human consequences. And the consequence of high unemployment and a very large number of people losing their jobs in a very short period of time, I think is something we're going to be confronted with very soon. And that is a massive hit to a lot of people and their families. We've seen the decision taken to reduce the percentage of GDP going to overseas aid. And for people who were campaigning against that decision, I heard people, I don't know whether they're accurate estimates, but I heard somebody suggesting that that reduction in our aid budget could lead to 100,000 children dying who would otherwise have lived. So these are very real balancing acts. My instinct, you'll be unsurprised to hear, is that we're more likely to come out of the economic damage by having a freer economy with lower taxes, not penalizing businesses and not penalizing entrepreneurs on whom we're going to rely to get businesses back up and running again.
This is fascinating, though, because we've agonised about this at the IEA, where we don't necessarily always agree amongst ourselves any more than the Conservative Party agrees amongst itself. But what's quite interesting here is that if you were to roll back 10 years to 2010, when the Conservative Party returned to office and the public finances were in a grim state then, folk like you and I would have been would have been described as deficit hawks. We've got to get the budget deficit sort of under control pretty fast. If anything, the government's not doing enough to tighten back on spending. We've really got to balance the books. Quite a lot of people of that philosophical mindset are now becoming sort of fiscal doves. Yes, there is a massive hole in the public finances, but it's been to deal with a one-off crisis, however well or badly you think the government has handled that. Perhaps we should just amortize this debt over 20 years, 30 years, promise to run budget surpluses. I mean, pray to God that becomes normal practice again over 20 or 30 years, and not worry too much that there's this £500 billion hit probably in total on the public finances. Just amortize it and take a rather dovish approach, pay it back over 25 years. Do you think that is the right approach, rather than the more strict orthodoxy of the Treasury that if we're spending X, we've got to raise X?
Well, I think it may be that we don't really have much choice, because the scale of this is just so huge. And certainly it's bigger than that massive deficit that we inherited in 2010. And of course, I always try to remind people the response that George Osborne put in place as Chancellor in 2010 was actually broadly what Alistair Darling, the Labour previous Chancellor, had proposed. Yeah. So the suggestion that it was the most grim austerity budget, it was what Alistair Darling thought was necessary to sort things out over time. So I think there is a bit of a balancing act. Nobody knows either what the wider environment will be. I hear people saying, well, the one thing we can say with some certainty, most countries around the world have run up similarly large debts and are in the same hole. And that might in itself affect the behavior of markets and might make it seem less exceptional, might make the UK still seem like quite a good place to invest and to allow British governments to borrow money and so on.
And I want to move on to some other policies at the moment. But before I do, I want your view on whether moving on to other policy ideas might always be moot. I mean, however bad the pandemic's been, it was a member of my family that put it to me, who actually said, it's been absolutely ghastly, but at least we're not arguing about Brexit anymore. But if you like, the Brexit issue just sort of dominated public debate really for about 4 years. Almost any and every public policy proposition was seen through the lens of Brexit. You've been a campaigner and an advocate for all sorts of reforms, certainly around education and grammar schools and the like. Do you think we're in for another, if you like, one issue parliament? I mean, last time Brexit, this time pandemic and aftermath thereof. and there just won't be, it's as if in public discourse, I mean, I appreciate both Brexit and this are very big issues, but there doesn't seem to be room for any other considerations. Do you think it's all just going to be about economic repair and quite possibly, a serious post-mortem and public inquiry and audit of whether we did the right thing at the right time?
Well, all of that is going to take a huge amount of this Parliament, I'm sure. But I would contend that in dealing with the aftermath of the pandemic, with dealing with the economic circumstances which we will face, actually we need to be more creative about other aspects of policy to try to make sure we get the best value solutions, that we can try to come up with ways to make sure that people are given better opportunities, education, retraining amongst them. The kind of proposition that Peter Lample at the Sutton Trust has been advancing for open access, that he reckons you could open up some of the best independent schools to people on needs blind basis, and the taxpayer could save money against what it would cost them to educate those children in the state sector. Some of those ideas, I think, would bring quite a lot to the party in terms of how you provide good quality services, help to enhance people's opportunities as we come out of the economic hole and the pandemic.
Well, one of those areas which was, if you rewind to December the 12th, general election day last year, which feels like it was in a different, century, let alone, less than a year ago, was the Conservatives' commitment to this sort of levelling up agenda. The mixture of Conservative representation in Parliament has changed, and quite a lot of areas that had voted Labour for generations fell to the Conservatives at the last election. And we've been told that a big mission of the government, perhaps understandably somewhat derailed by the pandemic, has been levelling up. I appreciate you're not a government spokesman, but can you tell me what levelling up means and what it consists of?
Well, I think that it's an important agenda. People have looked aghast for decades at the regional disparities in the United Kingdom, especially the North-South divide, so-called. Well, as a Northern Member of Parliament for a relatively affluent constituency in Greater Manchester, I've always given the caveat that it's a more complex picture than people sometimes suggest. But it is certainly true to say that across very large parts of the North and the Midlands, there are communities which do feel very much left behind, without the kind of employment opportunities, without very good educational opportunities frequently, and very often with poor infrastructure that makes it difficult for them to connect to the outside world, whether it be virtually on broadband or physically by traveling on trains that are, I saw the Pacer trains have just been got rid of after 40 years that we used to have around parts of the northwest of England. So I think there's a lot there in that agenda to try to make sure that you can increase the productivity of those parts of the North and Midlands which have been left behind. And by doing that, you can also create better opportunities for the people who live there and give them some real prospects and hope.
Okay, interesting. I should also say, I don't know if you've had a chance to look at it, Graham, or our viewers on either Zoom or YouTube has. There's an absolutely brilliant article in today's Times about the need to get back to the levelling up agenda. I should confess it's written by me, so I would probably think it was brilliant.
I'll make sure I do read it, Mark.
And I very much concur with your analysis. It does seem, and you're right, the picture's an awful lot messier and more patchwork than north and south. I mean, there are very poor parts of London, but I agree with your analysis. There do seem to be areas of the United Kingdom that have been left behind, where average wages have not kept a pace. I mean, you might expect them to be lower than London, but haven't kept up at the same clip. And opportunities and the rest of it don't seem to be in as numerous there as they are in the affluent parts of the UK, broadly London, the southeast, and the east of England being the most affluent parts. But I still don't understand what the prescription is. What I hear from the government is a very large amount of spending on infrastructure. If the government's going to spend money, I guess I'd prefer to spend it on infrastructure than consumption. But is that sort of it? It's to make sure that 5G exists in sort of parts of rural Cumbria and Hartlepool? Or is there going to be any kind of free market approach to trying to encourage entrepreneurialism? A point I made actually in my Times article was, if you look at company formation, which is not a perfect metric, but you might assume is a proxy for entrepreneurialism in some way. Company formation is much, much more common in London, the South East and the East of England than it is in the poorer northern parts of the economy. Not a perfect metric, but as I say, might be a smell or a sniff or a sign that entrepreneurialism isn't as rife in the poorer parts of the country. What's the free market sort of approaches that the government might take, rather than saying, well, we're going to build a new railway here or build a new road there, or we're going to spend money on a new roundabout somewhere else?
Yeah, or indeed move tens of thousands of civil servants to a different place,
Exactly.
or we'll build frigates somewhere rather than somewhere else, all of which might be beneficial. But I agree with the drift of your question that we ought to be trying to encourage enterprise in these places. I guess the free ports policy is the most obvious aspect of that. And it's early days. I think the bids have just been invited, but that might be an important part of it. I suspect some of these things though are going to be bigger challenges after this year than we had anticipated. And I might adduce as evidence. Manchester Airport is hugely important for my constituency and indeed for a large part of the northwest of England. And we've seen aviation as a sector almost reduced to rubble over the last few months, with long periods where people haven't even been allowed to fly, and then the restrictions that have quarantine and so on that have made it pretty unattractive for a lot of people to do so. So it may well be that some of those places which were previously great engines of economic growth and activity are going to be in need themselves of special treatment to get them back on their feet. So whether it's an air passenger duty holiday to get people back flying again, I would like to see things like, I've drifted away from the question, of course, but I'd like to see something a much more rapid airport testing regime, preferably test on departure, which most other countries seem to be adopting to allow a much quicker exit from quarantine. But there'll be a lot of those additional places that are going to need a freer environment so they can get themselves back going at full speed again.
Okay, well, I'm good. I'm glad that you're with me on that one. Please, well, we were discussing actually just before we went on air how impossible it is to bend the ear of a minister, even as a member of parliament these days. But anything you can do to get the government in a more liberalising direction, rather than believing that sort of central planning and government spending is always the route, would be hugely appreciated. I want to talk about the sort of state of politics with you a bit, Sir Graham, because obviously as your role on the 1922 committee, you are the definitive senior backbencher. Whenever you see senior backbenchers quoted in the newspapers, ladies and gentlemen, I'm not saying that's always Sir Graham Brady, but it's either Sir Graham Brady or people who wish they were Sir Graham Brady, basically. But what do you make of the state of our politics at the moment? I was looking back at what you said in 2014 at the Keith Joseph Memorial Lecture on the importance of ideas in politics, an inherent risk of Parliament basically just being used as lobby fodder by a government, and perhaps having a constantly critical opposition and it just being sort of Punch and Judy. How much worse have things got, both in part due to the lockdown, but in part two, I'm not really sure I can distinguish a great deal of meaningful difference between the government and the opposition on this big issue of the day. I mean, there's seems to be an enormous effort by both sides to confect some differences between the Labour front bench and the Conservative front bench, but they're hardly meaningful. Yourself and other Conservative rebels are effectively the opposition to the government on this one. And what do you think? How successfully can Parliament hold this government to account? That's been a problem since you mentioned it in 2014 and before. But is it now at crisis point? Parliament isn't really able to scrutinise or hold ministers to account.
Well, Mark, it certainly isn't a golden age of parliamentary democracy at the moment. I think things have been pretty poor. I think this, in some ways, this is one of the most fundamental questions for people who do believe in democracy, and it doesn't get enough attention. There's a great temptation, and the media does this, and I'm afraid you even did it then, referring to conservative rebels, when I might say that Parliament has got a distinct function and purpose separate from that of government, and that often those of us within the party that's in government will try very hard to be more constructive and more supportive in the way in which we approach a debate. But it's still our duty and obligation to scrutinise government and to hold government to account and to stand up and represent our constituents to government rather than the other way around. So, I think we need a much more mature understanding of that, and it'd be nice to see the media playing a role in that understanding, and certainly at a time like this, when, as you say, the opposition very often seems simply to say, well, we agree with the government, but we'd like far more of that, please. Can we lock down for longer, and can we lock down tighter? Then I think the obligation becomes even greater for other people to make sure there's a different voice and different analysis. And it's, of course, open to anybody to say that they don't agree with my approach, and they can say that they think by wanting to trust people more and have less coercion that I'd be taking greater risks with the virus than the government is. But I just think it's critically important that we have these debates, that there's a discussion, that we analyse whether there are different approaches that could be applied. And it might be, sorry, go on.
I was going to ask whether a constitutional reform you'd like to see, I think you have supported this previously, is a complete divorce between the executive and the legislature. If the executive is made up of people in the legislature, that sets certain career paths. You're a statistical outlier by becoming a famous politician who hasn't just sort of gone the ministerial route. Would you like to see a complete divorce, a situation in which the Houses of Parliament are more like the US Senate and the House of Representatives, and the executive are held to account by them? You obviously might be in the same political party, and the governing party may or may not have a majority in the legislature, but it wouldn't be mixing oil and water in the way our present constitution does.
I'm very attracted by a move to a proper separation of powers. And, I just think I understand the position of people who find themselves in government. I was coming back from a Conservative Party board meeting, bumped into a colleague who's a minister, and we had a quick conversation about the COVID response. And the minister made it pretty clear that she broadly agreed with what I've been saying. But of course, she can't say that because of collective responsibility. And then you get people who think they might quite like to be a minister, who might be more tempted always to follow whatever the party line is. I suppose what I'd say is that if you set up a system as we have, which effectively rewards people for a certain type of behavior, you shouldn't be surprised when they then adopt that form of behavior. And maybe they're far more rational than awkward buggers like me who will insist on saying what we think, even if it gets us in a little bit of trouble from time to time. So I think it would be healthy to do that. Increasingly, some of the arguments that used to be used against it, and I can remember writing some of these when I was at university myself, the arguments like the fact that it's a great benefit that ministers and members of parliament rub shoulders in the division lobby. I might say at the moment the government deputy chief whip has, I think, 220 proxy votes for colleagues, including most ministers. So the likelihood of bumping into most ministers in a division in the House of Commons at the moment is pretty close to zero. So some of these things aren't really working the way they used to, certainly at the moment. And maybe we do need to open it up a bit more.
And have you had any thought about, I don't want to go down completely obscure lines of hypothetical constitutional reforms, but you would like to see what, a directly elected prime minister and a separately elected House of Commons? Is that, and the prime minister would then appoint, as you can in the States, people to the cabinet who needn't be members of either House of Parliament?
Yeah, well, first of all, I'm going to say that I think this is a very interesting discussion. It's something I do have a lot of time for, but I don't think that this is a very good time to be thinking about massive constitutional upheaval. So I'm not going to be pushing for this as an immediate reform in response to the current crisis.
Let's get some more basic freedoms back first. Hey?
But I do certainly think you could have a directly elected prime minister. I guess you would simply structure that as being a recommendation from the people to the sovereign as to who should be the prime minister. Effectively, that's what we do anyway. We elect members of parliament from a particular party, and the leader of that party is going to be chosen as the prime minister. And there would be a constitutional crisis if the monarch said, "No, I don't like this person, send me another." So, I think, again, traditionally, the argument against the direct election was that it contradicted the sovereign's royal prerogative. I don't think that's a realistic argument anymore. And then, at risk of becoming deeply unpopular with all of my colleagues, has to be said as well, what you could do is reduce the size of the House of Commons then, because you need quite a big House of Commons at the moment in order to be able to supply,
to populate the departments, and
both the government bench and the opposition front bench all need to be populated from the House of Commons.
I've got a very easy solution to get you guys to vote for that, is that we agree on aggregate the parliamentary wage bill each year, and you guys then decide whether you want to divide that up 650 ways or whether you all want to be paid twice as much, but there'll only be half as many of you. That might change the incentives on actually reducing the size.
It's a great market solution, as I would expect.
Let me come, Sir Graham, if I might. We've got a whole plethora of questions in the chat now. Let me try and get through. These will be very eclectic. Edgar Warner's is the most popular. Why has the Tory government, Edgar wants to know, turned into the Green Party? Denmark and Australia, which have taken up similar policies, have the highest priced electricity in the world. How can you justify the enormous expense of the proposed measures, which will be particularly to the detriment of the poorest people in Britain, when the Chinese are building so many coal-fired power stations and we represent only 1% of world carbon emissions, and they are, in any case, already falling?
Well, I think that's a very good question. And I suppose what I often say to constituents talking about sometimes they're pressing for a greener approach, is that it's nice to have a greener approach. It's nice to have cleaner air. It's nice to have a better set of environmental outcomes. But you only get that if you're a prosperous society. And that this question, I think, embodies the tension in this. If you go too far too quickly, then you increase the cost to the point where you will make your economy unsuccessful. People get poorer, and poorer people tend to be much less interested in environmental policy. They're more interested in how they put food on the table and keep a roof over their heads. So I think it's in the interest of everybody in this debate to recognize that you need to strike that balance, and you need to try to make sure that you can continue to generate the wealth and the affluence of a whole society. Otherwise, this stops, and nobody wants to advance more environmental policies.
Okay, let me take another question. This is on goes to the economic and prosperity point as well, I guess. Martin Culip asks, why is the government even conceiving of increasing the minimum wage right now, let alone above the rate of inflation? at a time when its COVID policies are already forcibly pushing businesses to breaking point and throwing young people onto the dole. Have we gone back to the 1960s and the 70s, where both major parties seem to think that prices can just be set by politicians, and we've decided to give you all a pay rise because we've fixed what your salary is? Where do you think we've got to on the minimum wage issue, which has obviously been catching up with the median wage? It hasn't just been tracking it; it's been catching up with average salaries. At some point, it's going to have an employment effect, isn't it?
Yeah, and I guess one's got to say that in practice, over the last whatever it's been 20 years or so that we've had the minimum wage, it hasn't generally seemed to be a major impediment to the growth of employment. And I think particularly in the last few years, we've had what we were regularly in the habit, as Conservative politicians at least, of referring to as the jobs miracle, or this great employment miracle that was being achieved. And that was continuing while the cost of labour was being increased. And I think it's great if that can be the case. What we have to watch for is that tipping point where it ceases to be the case. And I think we do need to be careful in the current context with the massive pressures on parts of the private sector. And obviously, hospitality is perhaps the most obvious, but I've talked about aviation, tourism. There are many others which are under extreme pressure, and we need to be mindful of that and try to make sure that policy helps those industries to recover and helps people back into jobs. And if increases in the minimum wage were to get to the point where they were stopping that, that would be a very serious thing.
And of course, it might be, we could speculate that there have been other workarounds as well. Self-employment, for example, has gone up enormously since the minimum wage was introduced. I once jokingly asked of a Labour Party politician whether they thought if I was self-employed, the government should still enforce what I should be able to pay myself in salary, and they said yes. They thought they should. But obviously, it could be that although you haven't seen the dramatic unemployment in virtue of the minimum wage yet, that it's just led to changes in employment practices, that people perhaps aren't now getting jobs on the employed side, having an employer, and are therefore setting up their own businesses in some way and might be earning short of that. It's sort of, people are absolutely miraculous at finding wholly legal workarounds to government-imposed central schemes, I think. Let me take a few more questions from the chat. Christopher Marshall has asked two, and he has 4 votes for one of them and 3 for the other. But so rather than splitting the Christopher Marshall vote, because he isn't currently, I think, in clear first place, I'll take the 2 questions together. And I suppose they are connected. Christopher asks, the lockdown skeptics in Parliament all seem to be in the Conservative Party, on the Conservative benches. Has the reaction to the virus and the lockdown become a left-right issue? And then also asks, will Sir Graham be voting against the government tomorrow?
Well, I'm pretty certain to vote against the government tomorrow. I mean, my concerns about the impact on civil liberties and fundamental human rights are there regardless of how the tiers have been drawn. The fact that my own constituency has been put in entirely the wrong tier and without any good justification, unless that were to change, it makes it inevitable that I would vote against. I think it's a very interesting question. I do know some Labour members of Parliament who are very sceptical about the impact of lockdowns. 1 or 2 have been publicly so. I think of John Speller, who throughout on the floor of the House of Commons has been raising his concerns about loss of jobs and poverty also having a toll on people's health. And so he's been ploughing that furrow quite consistently over the months, but I know of others. I would say probably the Labour Party, certainly in the House of Commons, tends to be less independent in its approach. You get far more independent action within the Conservative Party, which if you talk to Conservative chief whips and former chief whips, they'll agree with a slightly pained expression and talk about herding cats and so on. But I guess we are a party that believes in individual liberty, and it's unsurprising, perhaps, that Conservative politicians have become a little bit harder to herd into the corral.
Well, on the isn't so much on the individual liberty question, I guess, because we've touched on your views on having freedom as a premise rather than an afterthought, and that you should start from that position. But this I guess touches on the lockdown rules. Peter Lucy asks, why is it safe to sit down in a cafe and have a cup of coffee, but not a beer in a pub? Assuming both businesses follow the distancing rules. Do you think there's a danger that the rules have got so complex that there are so many contradictions within them now? I mean, the government, on the one hand, is pursuing an anti-obesity strategy, but is also, over the summer, subsidising me to go out and eat in a restaurant, and now says if I want to drink a glass of wine or have a pint of beer, I have to have a substantial meal with it. I don't know whether I get arrested if I don't finish my greens or eat all my potatoes. But do you think the rules have become so confusing, so contradictory? You can continually point at, well, why can I do X, but I can't do Y? I think you're allowed to go for a walk around a golf course, but couldn't play a round of golf while doing so. That this brings the kind of rule of law into disrepute, doesn't it? If the rules as written bear really no logical scrutiny, whichever side of the argument you're on whether they're too authoritarian or not. It's a different point I'm making.
Some of these things have been completely crazy, and I think of the 10 p.m. curfew, that immediately it became obvious that it was counterproductive, because in the name of social distancing, you were forcing everybody to come out of every pub at the same time. And my family walked through Altrincham Town Centre one Saturday night a few weeks ago, and it was packed. So everybody knew that was a nonsense, but it was kept in place. Interestingly, now under the new tiers, the government has accepted that it was wrong and is getting rid of the 10 p.m. curfew and is going for an hour's drinking up time. Similarly, when the second lockdown was introduced, and people said, well, why can't I play golf or tennis outside? The response from the Prime Minister and the Chamber of the House of Commons was, if you start having exemptions for one thing or another, the whole thing unravels. So not really even a pretense that was logic behind it. And again, in the new tier arrangements, those things are allowed. I think the specific example given in the question, there's another slightly worrying thing, which is a sort of puritanical element in the formulation of policy, which is this sort of assumption that if any of us were to partake of drink in the evening, we will necessarily be incapable of conducting ourselves in a responsible way, and are bound to start hugging and kissing our friends or others who are not in our households, and the whole thing will spread infection wildly. And I think to assume that people can drink coffee safely, but are incapable of having a pint or two safely, I mean, well, I've said before, I just think we should treat people as grown-ups.
Very interesting. I've got a few here because I know we're on the clock a little bit that I'll try and take together. One anonymous attendee asked, does Sir Graham think the Tory party needs more libertarians or liberty-minded individuals? Slightly attached to that, another question is, what is Sir Graham Brady's definition of an open and free society? And how far away is the UK from his idea of this?
Okay, do we need more libertarians? Well, I just think most people, certainly who got involved with the Conservative Party in the last 40 years or so, have got a pretty strong strand of libertarian instinct. And, one might say that the Prime Minister would be amongst them. So what is my ideal of a free and open society. I'm not sure that I can pick one. In normal times, the UK isn't that bad because generally, even where we have some laws or rules that might irritate people, mostly people just muddle along reasonably happily and don't go overly heavy-handed in enforcement. We have, though, moved a very long way away from it. And my friend in the House of Commons, Charles Walker, last week was filmed and got a certain amount of attention as he got very concerned seeing a 72-year-old woman who was standing alone after 15 people had been in a socially distanced demonstration, and she was manhandled into a police van by 4 police officers. Now, Charles and I have both commented on this and made the point that it would be wrong for us as legislators just to blame the police for that. Parliament has allowed the creation of emergency laws, which, amongst other things, make peaceful protest illegal in this country. Yep. And the police then sometimes might be a little overzealous in enforcing it. But so we should expect that the police to be proportionate in their enforcement. But we have put these laws in place, and it makes me very queasy.
Well, interesting. I just wonder if I could ask you a supplementary on this, both in terms of civil liberties, but I might also press you on the economy as well, and not just in the context of this pandemic and the lockdown. Let's cross our fingers, hope, pray, or assume that, if you like, we'll get back to normal at some point next year. But do you think the longer term drift, let's say over the last 5, 10 or 15 years, has been away from civil liberties and a lightly regulated economy and the government as the last resort rather than the first resort for everybody's needs? Are people of your and my mindset slowly but surely losing the battle? And it might just be that the pandemic and the response to it is a particularly steep erosion of liberty, but on what has otherwise been a pretty steady downward graph for some considerable time. Or are you more optimistic than
that? I think you're right about what has been happening over a period of quite a long period now, more than the last few years. I think looking ahead, it could go either way. And I'm an incurable optimist, and I just hope that the experience of this year is going to spur people into standing up for liberty. And certainly the reaction that I've had in speaking out over the last few weeks and months has been, I wouldn't say it's been universally positive. Nobody gets a universally positive reaction for anything, especially on social media. But it has been pretty good and pretty positive. I think a lot of people were feeling that they were like the famous frog in a pan of water, and that there was never a point when it was acceptable to jump out and say, look, this has got to stop. But I think the more we've seen the kind of extreme intervention of government in people's private lives, the more people, I think, will come to object. And interestingly, I think, and perhaps you would expect this, I think the young in particular are quite fired by this argument. And of course, in the context of COVID, it's added to by the fact that they know they personally are probably less vulnerable in most instances. But they also, I think, have felt quite acutely in many cases the loss of their own freedom, their own ability to socialize, whether it be young teenagers who are able to mix with their class at school but not allowed to see them at home, or even in the park in many parts of the rules that we've had, or young adults who can't meet a partner. And these things have, I've had conversations in my constituency surgery with people who have been in tears because of loneliness. Somebody in particular, I think of, who specifically had a boyfriend on the other side of the Welsh border when the Welsh border had been closed. And these are serious things. They will stay with people. And I hope if there's a positive to come out of this, it will be that those people will value their freedom more. And I hope they'll be more vigilant in its defense in the future.
I want to wrap up with two quick questions. Although when I say this is a quick question, I'm not quite sure, Sir Graham, how you're going to be able to give a quick answer, because it reminds me of that story of somebody who squeezed in a question right at the end of a hustings, promising the question was extremely short, so he was allowed to give it. And the question was, what would you do about the Northern Ireland problem? This is perhaps not so complicated. If Sir Graham were the next Prime Minister, how would he approach the next pandemic? What would he do differently from the current people at Number 10? I mean, you've mentioned your philosophical approach would be on the freedom side rather than the caution side. You know, freedom might be a rebuttable presumption, but would be the starting point. But do you think there's anything else, if you like, structurally, that the government might have got wrong? I mean, is there a danger, I hesitate to say this, but that we've fallen for the sort of tyranny of the science, that, you know, public policy now needs to be set by scientists rather than scientists explaining infection rates or whatever else, or how to cure the disease? These people seem to have morphed into policy makers rather than experts on pandemics or whatever. Structurally, how could we have tackled it?
Well, I certainly think that there should be, if you like, competing teams of scientists. There shouldn't just be one strand of scientific opinion and advice being given. There should be more challenge, and that should be a more open process. And I think government would have benefited from that. I think one of the things that concerns me, sure as eggs is eggs, there will be another pandemic at some point. Hopefully it won't be for 100 years, but maybe it'll be in 2 or 3 years' time. And again, I think one of the difficulties, the more you lock down and the more damage you do, particularly economically, the less likely you are going to be able to respond very seriously again. And so, I think if we were, God forbid, to have a much more virulent virus than this in 2 years' time, are we seriously going to lock the whole economy down for 6 months or a year and see the massive loss in our ability to sustain employment and to sustain public services and so on? So I think that's a very serious concern. I think a lot of lessons have already been learned in the handling of this pandemic. And so I think, for instance, in the protection of people in care homes, the way in which hospitals can be kept in COVID areas and non-COVID areas, the importance of proper protective equipment, these are lessons which are important.
That's very interesting, though. Do you? I'm sorry to always be on the pessimistic side, but you've said your optimism is unbounded. So I've got to play devil's advocate and put you the more pessimistic questions. Do you think that there might be a danger? And again, I'll be careful what I say here, because I think COVID-19 is considerably worse than standard flu. But do you not think that? I mean, enormously worse. Do you not think there might be a problem in future where we don't get the next pandemic, but we do get a nasty bout of seasonal flu? Potentially the sort of thing that I gather historically might actually bring about the death of 20 or 30,000 British citizens, likely at the end of their lives, likely with underlying conditions. I'm not suggesting that the government would pounce on that and immediately lock down the economy, but do you think that incidents like that, falling short of a pandemic, another terrible pandemic in 100 years' time, might start to lead to the erosion of liberties? Might be, well, you've got to wear a face mask on public transport until this nasty bout of flu is over, or you've got to have social distancing in pubs. I mean, the pubs can be open and can sell beer without a substantial meal, but the capacity's got to be 50 per pub, not 100 per pub. That actually, having got the taste for these restrictions in a pandemic, something that's serious but nothing like as serious, will in future allow these sort of civil liberty intrusions. We never would consider it possible to surrender civil liberties to deal with a bout of seasonal flu in the past. Might that unfortunately become the norm in the future?
Yeah, no, you really are getting me down now, Mark. I think there has to be a danger. We have to remember, normally, flu kills between 7 and 20,000 people in this country every year. And if you get a particularly bad one, it could be more than that. So, flu is serious. this is, as you say, it's more serious, especially for certain vulnerable groups. I think there has to be a very significant danger that the policy response to a normal, let's say a middling flu year, might be heavy-handed. Again, I guess you might find that it goes two ways. You might have half the population deciding they should stay at home for the winter, and half the population saying, who cares, we're not going to do this again.
Somebody said we might have moved on from Brexit, but we're still split between Remainers and Leavers, people who want to remain at home and people who want to leave the house. It's just Remain and Leavers defined in different ways. Very final question.
It's so much easier to resolve, though, because you can let people make the choice for themselves.
Exactly. You don't need to make the same decision across the board. My last question, which my staff did insist they wanted to be put to you, that you've said that you think over the past 30 or 40 years or so, people who've tended to join the Conservative Party have been liberty-minded. But somebody wants to know, who is your favourite thinker, philosopher, or economist?
Gosh, I'm not sure I'm going to come up with any.
I remember Margaret Thatcher was once asked this, and she said she was asked for her 3 favourite economists, and she said Milton Friedman and Patrick. No, she was asked for her favourite economists, and she said Patrick Minford and Milton Friedman. Thank God they didn't ask me to name 3, because I'm not sure I could have found a third.
Well, I guess I could go Roger Scruton, or I could go. Even you mentioned that I gave the Keith Joseph lecture for another think tank a few years ago. Actually, Keith was quite a great thinker as well.
A great thinker. Well, Sir Graham, we've overrun the hour by a minute, so I'm sorry to have overrun this session and taken a little bit more of your time, but I haven't overrun as badly as most government estimates. It's only a % or 2 there. Thank you so much for joining us, Sir Graham, and kicking off our IEA in Conversation series. Thanks for answering so many wide-ranging questions so honestly and intelligently and optimistically. I always welcome optimism here at the IEA. I might not have it myself, but it's always great when a guest has. So it's been a real pleasure, Sir Graham. Thanks very much indeed for spending some time with us this evening. Thank you to all of you who have been watching us on YouTube and Zoom. I'm sorry I couldn't get through all of your questions, but thanks very much for joining us. If you've enjoyed the video on YouTube, please give it a thumbs up. If you're not yet a subscriber to our channel on YouTube, we've more than doubled our number of subscribers, I think, over the course of this year. Please click the subscribe button and hit that notification bell next to it. That will keep you informed of upcoming IEA London events. But I'm going to keep you informed of the next couple of upcoming IEA online events right now. Next Tuesday at 6:30 p.m, I'll be hosting the second of these In Conversation series, this time with Linda Whetstone. Linda's the former chair of the Atlas Network of Free Market Think Tanks and the daughter of the IEA's founder, Sir Anthony Fisher. Her dedication to free markets extends across the globe, and she promotes the work of think tanks like the IEA in multiple languages and jurisdictions. We will also be returning for Live with Littlewood on this coming Wednesday at 6 p.m. I'll be back in this very same seat, chairing a special episode dedicated to this year's Richard Koch Breakthrough Prize essay competition. This is, what free market ideas do you have to supercharge left behind Britain, something we were touching on with Sir Graham earlier. And the best idea will win, I kid you not, £50,000. And to begin with, so you certainly won't be left behind yourself if you come up with the best idea. You'll supercharge your own pockets, but you will have contributed a public service as well by coming up with good ideas to help the poorer parts of the economy. And last but not least, the IEA will be rounding up our year of virtual events with the Hayek Lecture, our annual Hayek Lecture, delivered virtually this year. That will be delivered by our Head of Education, Dr. Steve Davis. So keep an eye out on our YouTube channel and on social media for that as well. Thank you very much for joining us, for all of our audience. My particular thanks again to Sir Graham Brady. It's been an absolute pleasure to spend an hour in your company. Thanks very much, everybody. Over and out.